I am Maria Hunt, 27 years old. Exactly 14 days before my wedding, my biological father looked straight into the eyes of my fiancé and growled, "She is a liar." My mother stepped closer, her eyes streaked with hatred. "She got pregnant at 18 and threw the baby away like a bag of trash. Do not let this tramp trap you." I sat there, silent. They thought they were tearing my soul apart once more in front of the man I loved. But I was silent for a different reason. They had no idea that Ben had already found her. For the past 6 months, he had been quietly fixing everything they had cruelly destroyed, and they never expected that the child they forced me to abandon 8 years ago would walk into our rehearsal dinner. That night, every crime they tried to bury came back to life, and the power they thought they controlled shattered completely. Before we continue, if this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and leave your location and local time in the comments below. I want to know where in the world you are listening from. This is the record of how my own parents tried to destroy my life, and how the daughter I once lost came back to settle it all. Now, let us go back in time to March 15th, 2023, at a military hospital expansion project, the place where fate arranged for me to meet him again, for the first time after 8 years of silence. The air in the north wing of the military hospital smelled like wet gypsum and old sweat. It was a thick, chalky scent that coated the back of my throat, making every breath feel heavy. Outside, the Boston wind rattled the loose plastic sheets covering the unfinished window frames. Inside, the world was a cacophony of jackhammers and the high-pitched whine of concrete saws. I walked through the chaos with my spine as straight as a steel rod. I was wearing my digital camouflage, the fabric stiff and smelling of industrial detergent. My hard hat was pulled low. Under my arm, I gripped a thick roll of blueprints for the new trauma ward. It was March 15th, 2023. A Tuesday. Tuesdays were usually for logistics and paperwork, not for ghosts. I did not see him until I turned the corner of the hallway where the drywall was still being taped. I slammed into a solid chest. The impact sent the blueprints sliding across the dusty concrete floor. "I am sorry," I snapped, my voice falling into the sharp, clipped tone I used with subordinates. I did not look up. I reached down for the papers. Another hand reached for them at the same time. A large hand with a small, jagged scar across the knuckle of the index finger. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my face did not move. It was a reflex I had perfected in the sand and heat of Iraq. Face locked, eyes cold. I looked up. It was Ben. He was wearing a neon safety vest over a rugged flannel shirt, his dark hair dusted with white powder. He looked older. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 8 years ago. He held the blueprints out to me, his gaze scanning my face with the intensity of an architect looking for a crack in the foundation. "Maria," he said. His voice was low, cutting through the noise of the machinery. "Foster," I replied. I used his last name. It was a shield. I took the blueprints and tucked them back under my arm. We ended up sitting on a stack of cinder blocks in a room that would eventually be an operating theater. The walls were a dismal, unpainted gray. I sat with my back against the only finished wall, my eyes constantly tracking the red glow of the exit sign down the hall. It was a habit, a survival mechanism. I needed to know how to get out. Ben did not push. He did not try to bridge the 1-meter gap I had placed between us. He simply set 2 paper coffee cups down on the concrete. The steam rose in thin, disappearing wisps. The heat from the cups seeped through the calluses on my palms, the only warmth in the frigid room. We sat in silence for 3 hours. The construction crew moved around us like a blurred time-lapse. The coffee grew cold, forming a dark, oily film on the surface. "I never stopped looking for you," Ben finally said. The words were a direct hit. My post-traumatic stress disorder, the invisible monster that lived in the base of my skull, dug its claws into my brain. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the phantom weight of a 15-kilogram ceramic plate carrier pressing down on my lungs. I could lead a platoon through a minefield without blinking. but looking at Ben made my hands shake so violently I almost knocked over my cup. I could not tell him. I could not tell him about the basement in Wellesley. I could not tell him about my mother, Patricia, and how she had looked at me with pure disgust while I was screaming in pain. I could not tell him that our daughter had been treated like a shameful secret to be disposed of. If I told him the truth, he would try to fight my parents. He was an architect. He built things. My parents were demolition experts. They would ruin him just to prove they could. I had to protect him, even if it meant he had to hate me. I took a breath of the dusty air and looked him dead in the eye. I spoke with the flat, emotionless delivery of a casualty report. "I have a child, Ben," I said. He froze. "She is 8 years old," I continued, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "But she is not yours. I slept with someone else almost immediately after I left you. I chose him. I chose a different life." I waited for the explosion. I waited for him to stand up, call me a liar, and walk out into the Boston cold. I wanted him to leave. If he left, he was safe. But Ben did not move. He did not yell. He sat there, staring at my hands. I realized then that I was gripping the edge of the cinder block so hard my knuckles were white, bone white. Ben leaned forward, his voice steady and dangerously quiet. "You are a very good soldier, Maria," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You know how to hold a line. You know how to take a hit without flinching." He stood up, towering over me in the gray room. "But you are a terrible liar," he whispered. He did not look angry. He looked devastated, but underneath that there was a sharp, calculating focus. He was an architect. He knew when a structure was failing because of an external force. "I know your family, Maria. I know the kind of people George and Patricia Hunt are," he said. He took a step toward the exit, then stopped and looked back at me over his shoulder. "What did they finally do to you back then?" he asked. "What did they finally do to you back then?" I did not answer. I could not. I just blinked, and for a split second, the sound of the jackhammers vanished. The smell of drywall dust was replaced by the cloying, suffocating scent of lavender perfume. The gray hospital walls dissolved into the expensive wallpaper of my childhood bedroom. The noise of the construction turned into a sharp, metallic click. It was the sound of my mother locking my door from the outside 8 years ago. The sharp, metallic click of the deadbolt was the last sound of my old life. In Wellesley, silence is a luxury. But in the Hunt house, silence was a cold weapon. January 2017. I remember the way the winter light hit the glass coffee table in the living room. The pregnancy test sat right there between us. 2 pink lines. A death sentence for the girl I used to be. My mother, Patricia, did not scream. Screaming was for people who lost control, and Patricia Hunt never lost anything she could not fix with a checkbook or a threat. She just poured a cup of Earl Grey, her movements precise, her face a mask of cold marble. "You will ruin this family's reputation," she said. Her voice was not a mother's voice. It was the sound of reading a verdict. "You will handle this mistake quietly. I will not have the neighbors at the country club looking at us with pity." I reached for my phone. I needed to call Ben. I needed to tell him that the future we whispered about, the one with the small house and the big dog, was suddenly, terrifyingly real. Patricia did not argue. She stepped forward, snatched the device from my hand, and brought a heavy crystal paperweight down on the screen. "No phones," she whispered, her eyes veined with hatred. "No Ben. No distractions." The next 8 months were a masterclass in psychological warfare. They called it protection. I called it a cage. The second-floor bedroom became my entire universe. George, my father, had removed the interior lock and replaced it with a heavy brass bolt on the outside. Every morning at 7 a.m., the bolt would slide back. A tray would appear, lukewarm water. Patricia would stand in the doorway, smelling of that cloying, expensive lavender perfume. She never looked me in the eye. She looked at the floor, as if seeing me would stain her vision. I was not a daughter. I was a prisoner of war. The baby kicked for the first time in April. A small rhythmic thud against my ribs. I had no books. No prenatal vitamins except the ones Patricia shoved at me with my dinner. No one to ask if I was okay. I would sit on the edge of the bed and whisper to my stomach, telling the tiny life inside me about the world outside. About the Charles River. About the way Ben's eyes crinkled when he laughed. I promised the baby that I would never be like Patricia. I promised that her life would be built on love, not reputation. I swore that I would find a way out, even if it took every ounce of strength I had left. But the silence of the house was a heavy blanket that swallowed my promises whole. I started writing notes, small scraps of paper I tore from the margins of old magazines. Help me. Ben, I'm at the house. Call the police. I tried to drop one out the window when the gardener was mowing the lawn. The door flew open. It was George. He did not hit me. That would leave marks. Instead, he walked into the room carrying the heavy office shredder. He plugged it into the wall by my nightstand. "Give them to me, Maria," he said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any warmth. I handed him the notes. The machine whirred to life with a high-pitched, hungry sound. He fed the papers in one by one. "Try it again," George said, leaning over me until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Call the cops. I will tell them you have had a mental breakdown. You are a hunt. You will do what is expected, or you will be nothing." George twisted the knife. He told me Ben had moved on. He said Ben did not want the burden of a girl like me. He said I was a stain that everyone was trying to wash away. I wanted to scream that he was lying, but the shredder was louder. August 13th, 2017. Around midnight, a sharp, white-hot blade of pain sliced through my lower back. The water broke, a warm rush that soaked the floral sheets. I crawled to the door. I hammered on the wood until my palms were raw, until the skin split and left red smears on the white paint. "Mom, help me!" I screamed. I heard them. I heard the floorboards creaking in the hallway. But the bolt did not move. They left me there for 2 hours, riding the waves of agony alone in the dark. If you have ever felt trapped by the people who were supposed to love you, you know this pain. It stays with you long after the doors are unlocked. I need to hear your voices. If you are standing with me, please hit that like button and subscribe. In the comments, write the word strength. Tell me the time and where you are listening from. I read every single one. They loved the military family label. But the moment I became inconvenient, the uniform was pushed behind the winter coats. They did not want an officer. They wanted a ghost. I watched the seasons change through the glass. The smell of freshly cut grass was a reminder of the freedom I had lost. The clock on the wall ticked. Finally, the brass bolt slid back with a thud. Patricia Hunt stood there. "Get up," she snapped. "The car is waiting. Let us get this over with." The door in Wellesley didn't just open, it vanished. The darkness of my bedroom was swallowed by the blinding, sterile glare of a delivery room. 3:42 a.m. Newton Wellesley Hospital. The air didn't smell like home. It smelled like bleach, industrial-grade floor wax, and the metallic tang of blood. My blood. 16 hours. I'd been in that bed for 16 hours of white-hot tearing. My body was a house on fire, and I was trapped in the basement. Across the room, George and Patricia stood in the corner. They didn't sit. They didn't offer a cup of water. They stood with their arms crossed, silent and stone-faced, like factory foremen overseeing a defective production line. A woman in a cheap navy suit stood by the door, a social worker. She held a clipboard with a heavy metal hinge. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the clock, waiting for the product to arrive so she could file the paperwork and go back to her suburban life. "Push, Maria," the doctor said. He sounded bored. Just another Tuesday shift. I pushed until the world went black at the edges. No one held my hand. No one wiped the sweat from my eyes. Then, a sound broke through the hum of the heart monitor. A thin, jagged cry that sliced the sterile air in half. The doctor moved to hand the bundle to the social worker. Patricia stepped forward, her hand already out, a silent command. But then, a young nurse, a girl no older than I was, with a name tag that said Sarah, hesitated. She looked at my parents, then at the social worker, and then at me. She made a choice. Sarah bypassed them all. She leaned down and placed the warm, wet weight of the baby directly onto my chest. 90 seconds. That was all the universe gave me. My brain went into overdrive, not as a mother, but as a soldier. I needed intel. I needed to mark the target. I felt the heat of her skin against mine. 6 pounds, 8 ounces. I could tell just by the weight. She had a thick shock of black hair, darker than mine. I shifted her small, shivering body just enough to see her left shoulder. There it was. A small, faint birthmark. A crescent moon, tucked right against the curve of her collarbone. "I am so sorry," I whispered. My voice was a ghost. My cheek brushed her forehead. She smelled like copper and new life. 90 seconds was up. Patricia's hand was a claw. She reached down and snatched the baby from my chest. She didn't even look at the child. She handed the bundle to the social worker like a bag of dry cleaning. "No!" I tried to scream, but the word died in my throat. The doctor was already there with a needle. A thick, cold liquid hit my vein. The room began to spin. The light smeared into long white streaks. I saw George's face hovering over me, blurry and distant. "Where are they taking her?" I gasped. "What is her name?" "She doesn't have a name." Patricia's voice drifted through the haze, cold as a Boston winter. "Not one that concerns you." The world went gray. When I woke up, the sun was cutting through the hospital blinds. The room was empty. No baby, no nurse. Just the rhythmic, mocking beep of the monitor. George sat in the chair by the bed. He didn't ask how I felt. He just stood up and shoved a ballpoint pen into my hand. He placed a stack of papers on the rolling tray. Relinquishment of parental rights. The words swam in front of my eyes. I was still floating on a cloud of high-grade sedatives. My hand felt like it belonged to someone else. "Sign it, Maria," George said. "We are not going through this again. You want that Army scholarship? You want to be a hero? Sign the paper and let us go home." He grabbed my wrist, guiding the pen. I felt the scratch of the nib against the parchment. The ink bled into the grain of the paper, a wound that would never close. Patricia walked in as the ink dried. She was wearing a fresh silk blouse, not a hair out of place. She looked at me with a terrifying kind of pity. "You will thank me for this when you grow up," she said. 3 days later, I was back in Wellesley. My parents threw a small tea party for their friends from the parish. Cucumber sandwiches, Earl Grey, fine china clinking in the garden. They told everyone I was resting before heading off to serve my country. They smiled, they laughed. They acted like the last 9 months had never happened. I stood in my room and looked at the girl in the mirror. I took a pair of heavy kitchen shears and hacked off my hair. Long, dark strands fell to the floor like dead leaves. I pulled my duffel bag from the closet. I didn't take much. No photos, no memories, just the basics. I didn't say goodbye. I walked down the stairs, past the clinking china and the fake laughter, and walked out the front door. I drove straight to the recruiting station in a strip mall near the highway. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and cheap grease from the McDonald's next door. I walked up to the sergeant behind the desk. He looked at my chopped hair, my hollow eyes, and the way I stood with my shoulders back, ready to break. "I want to enlist," I said. "Active duty, infantry. Send me somewhere loud." "Family okay with this?" he asked, looking at my Wellesley address on the ID. "I don't have a family," I said. I traded the silk sheets for a thin green wool blanket. I traded my name for a serial number. I went to war because I wanted to die for something real, rather than live for something fake. But as I stood there, years later, looking at Ben across the freezing water of the Charles River in 2024, I realized I hadn't died. And neither had the memory of that crescent moon birthmark. "Maria." Ben's voice broke the silence of the winter afternoon. I looked at him, the wind biting into my face. "I signed the papers, Ben," I whispered, "but I never said goodbye." The hospital mirror in Newton Wellesley blurred. The harsh, white glare of the recovery room stretched and cooled until it became the slate gray sky over Boston. December 20th, 2024. The wind off the Charles River didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the smell of diesel exhaust from Storrow Drive and the sharp, briny salt of the Atlantic. I stood on the esplanade, my boots crunching on a patch of dirty, frozen slush. My shoulders were square under my black wool coat. I was scanning the Longfellow Bridge, my eyes moving mechanically, counting the cars, tracking the pedestrians. It was a habit I couldn't kick. I didn't like being out in the open, too much exposure, too many angles to cover. Ben was beside me. He didn't look like an architect today. He looked like a man who had reached the end of a very long fuse. He stopped near a rusted iron railing, the ice under his feet cracking like small arms fire. He didn't say a word. He just reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a small dark velvet box. The lid snapped open. A sapphire. It was a deep, bruised blue, set in a heavy platinum band that looked like it had survived a century. A Foster family heirloom. It looked solid, unbreakable. "I lost 8 years, Maria," Ben said. His breath was a thick white cloud that vanished in the wind. "I am not losing 8 more days." I stepped back, one precise pace, a tactical retreat. The ring was beautiful, but it felt like a thermal detonator. It was a golden cage built on the rotten foundation of the lie I told him in the drywall dust of that hospital project. I looked at the sapphire, then at the gray churning water of the river. I couldn't take it. I couldn't accept a piece of his future while I was still carrying the corpse of his past. "I lied to you, Ben," I said. My voice was a flat, dead thing. It was the same tone I used to report a destroyed Humvee or a casualty list. No inflection, no emotion, just the facts. Ben didn't close the box. He didn't flinch. He just watched me with those architect's eyes, the kind that saw through the facade to the structural failure underneath. "The child I told you about in 2023, the one I said wasn't yours." I took a breath. The freezing air burned my throat like lie. "She is yours. I was pregnant when I left you. My parents, Patricia and George, they didn't just disapprove. They locked me in that house in Wellesley like a prisoner of war. They took her from me 90 seconds after she was born. They forced me to sign her away while I was still high on the sedatives they let the doctor pump into my veins." I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. I waited for the box to snap shut. I waited for him to call me a coward or a liar. I waited for the sound of his boots walking away, leaving me alone on the frozen riverbank. I deserved the silence. I deserved the abandonment. Instead, I felt his hands. They weren't soft. They were hard, calloused from years of handling blueprints and site visits. He gripped my shoulders through the thick wool of my coat, his fingers digging in. I opened my eyes. He wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He was looking at me like I was a building with a fatal crack he finally understood how to fix. The anger wasn't directed at me. It was a cold, focused heat radiating toward the west, toward Wellesley. "Where?" he asked. One word, sharp as a bayonet. "I don't know," I whispered. It was a closed adoption. They used their lawyers and their church connections to erase the trail. They made sure she vanished. Ben stood up straight. He shoved the ring box back into his pocket. He didn't mention the marriage. He didn't mention the 8 years of silence. His mind had already shifted. He wasn't a lover anymore. He was a strategic commander. "If our daughter is out there," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "I need her coordinates." He pulled out his phone. His thumb moved across the glass screen with predatory precision. "Wellesley is a fortress of old money and secrets," he muttered, his jaw set like granite. "But even concrete has stress points. Tomorrow I am sending my DNA to 23 and me an ancestry. If she has a mouth and a swab, we will find her. The system doesn't care about your mother's reputation. It only cares about a genetic match." He looked at me then, truly looked at me. For the first time since 2017, I didn't feel like a lone scout behind enemy lines. I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of a 15-kilogram plate carrier on my chest. "You have been fighting this war by yourself for way too long, Maria," Ben said. He stepped closer, blocking the freezing wind with his body. "The mission just changed. We are not just surviving anymore. We are hunting. He tapped a contact on his screen. A private investigator he used for messy zoning disputes and background checks on crooked contractors. Hey, Ben said into the phone, his eyes locked on mine. I need you to pull a specific file. Hunt, Wellesley, August 2017. Don't ask questions. Just get me the paperwork and the names of every social worker on the Hunt payroll back then. He hung up and looked at the frozen river, his face a mask of cold determination. We're going to find her, Maria, and then we're going to burn their house of cards to the ground. The ice on the river groaned, a deep, booming sound that echoed under the bridge. I stood there, a soldier who finally had a teammate. I looked at Ben's phone, the small screen glowing with the first tactical step of our counteroffensive. Ben, I said, my voice finally cracking. Don't, he replied, his hand moving to the back of my neck, pulling me forward until our foreheads touched. Save it for the day we bring her home. The wind howled, but for the first time in 8 years, I didn't feel cold. I felt dangerous. The text Ben sent on that frozen riverbank wasn't a promise. It was a tactical launch. January 2025 arrived like a slab of wet concrete. The air in Boston was a thick, gray soup of salt and exhaust. Ben didn't make a speech when the DNA kit arrived in a plain white box. He sat at his kitchen table, a small plastic tube in his hand. He didn't look hopeful. He looked clinical. He spit into the vial, capped it, and sealed the biohazard bag with the steady hand of a man redlining a blueprint. On the form, he checked the box for ancestry and heritage, a cover story for the algorithm, a way to bypass the red flags of the closed adoption system. Then came the static. 8 months of it. I went back to the base. I lived in the motor pool, surrounded by the smell of burnt oil and hydraulic fluid. My life was a series of repetitive, grinding motions. I checked the torque on lug nuts. I bled brake lines. I folded my laundry into sharp, square blocks that looked like they'd been cut with a laser. It was the only way to keep the monster in my head from screaming. I kept my phone taped to the inside of my thigh, right against the skin, always on vibrate, always on high alert. Every time a notification buzzed, my heart hit my ribs like a sledgehammer. But it was never the match. It was just junk mail or logistics updates. Ben stayed in the city. He didn't call to vent. He didn't ask how I was holding up. We were two scouts in different foxholes, waiting for the same flare to light up the sky. September 3rd, 2025. 2 p.m. Ben was in his office staring at a residential spec sheet for a condo project in the seaport. The email notification pinged. The subject line didn't say congratulations. It said, new relative matches found. He clicked. The blue light from the monitor etched deep, jagged lines into his face. He didn't breathe. There, at the top of the list, was a match that made the air in the room turn to ice. Parent/child match, Benjamin Foster. 50.0% shared DNA. The other end of the link was a girl. She didn't have a name on the site, just a generic username. But the location was a pinpoint on a map. Brookline, Massachusetts. A family named Walsh. They were wealthy, established. The kind of people who bought organic kale and sent their kids to private prep schools. They had screened the girl for genetic markers to check for potential health risks. They weren't looking for a father. They found one anyway. Ben didn't call me. He knew I'd burn the highway down to get to Brookline with a loaded sidearm if he did. He did what architects do. He looked for the structural weakness. He called a guy named Murphy. Murphy was a retired Boston cop who lived on Marlboro's cigarettes and a grudge against the city's elite. Ben handed him a stack of cash and the name Walsh. Find the paper trail, Ben told him. Start with the church charities in Wellesley. Find the social worker who handled the handoff in August 2017. Don't stop until you have a face. 48 hours later, Murphy delivered. A thick, heavy manila envelope landed on Ben's desk. 23 pages. It wasn't a story. It was a dossier. It had everything. Tax records for the Walshes. A copy of the charitable donation they made to a specific religious foundation the week the girl was born. a bribe trail disguised as a legal fee, and at the very back, 3 grainy surveillance photos. September 21st, 2025. I walked into Ben's apartment at 8 p.m. I smelled like diesel and stale coffee. My boots were caked with the mud of a training range. Ben was sitting at the kitchen table. He wasn't eating. He just had that manila envelope in front of him. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. He didn't say a word. He didn't say, "I found her." He just reached into the envelope and slid a single 4x6 glossy print across the wood. The girl was standing on a swing set in a park that looked like it belonged on a postcard. She was 8 years old. She was wearing a thick purple wool sweater and white leggings. She had dark, curly hair that fell over her forehead in the exact same way mine did when I was a kid. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her eyes bright with a joy I hadn't felt in a decade. But my brain didn't process the laugh. It didn't process the sweater. It locked onto a single, physical detail. The girl's collar had slipped. The heavy wool of the sweater had tucked down low on her left side, exposing the curve where her neck met her shoulder. There it was. Faint. Small. A pale crescent moon shape etched into the skin. The mark I had memorized in the 90 seconds of heat I was allowed in that hospital bed. The mark I had whispered to every night for 8 years. My legs didn't just shake, they quit. I hit the floor. The sound was a dull, heavy thud against the hardwood. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they'd been filled with wet sand. I stared at the photo on the table from the floor, my breath coming in short, jagged hitches that sounded like a dying engine. "That is her," I rasped. My voice was a shredded thing. Ben didn't move to help me up. He knew better. He just leaned forward, his shadow falling over me like a shield. "Her name is Lily Walsh," he said. His voice was cold, lethal. "And your mother told the Walshes that you were a drug addict who died in a ditch 3 days after the birth." I looked up at him. The grief was gone. The air in the room suddenly smelled like ozone, the way it does right before a lightning strike. "They told them I was dead?" I asked. Ben nodded. He tapped the 23-page file. "Patricia signed the affidavit herself. She sold your daughter, Maria. And she killed you on paper to make sure the sale was final." I stood up. My back was a steel rod. I didn't feel the floor anymore. "Ben," I said. "Yeah?" "Get the car." February 14th, 2026. Valentine's Day in Boston. Most people were out buying overpriced roses or waiting for a table at some dimly lit steakhouse. I was sitting in a room that smelled like expensive lemon oil and old oak. Brookline. The kind of neighborhood where the silence on the streets is heavy, protected by invisible walls of old money. I sat on the edge of a velvet armchair in the Walsh's living room. My back was a steel beam. My hands were folded in my lap, nails digging into my palms until the skin started to break. I wasn't wearing my uniform, but I felt like I was in a bunker. Across from us sat Jennifer and Michael Walsh. They were the kind of people I'd been taught to respect. Educated, calm, and deeply protective. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a lawyer sitting in the corner with a briefcase that looked like it cost more than my first car. Jennifer pushed a thin, weathered folder across the mahogany coffee table. Her eyes were tired. "We didn't know you were looking," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath. "When Lily turned 3, we asked the adoption agency to find you. We wanted her to have the truth. We wanted her to know her mother." My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. "I never got a call," I said. My voice was a dry rasp. Not a letter, not a ping on a screen, nothing. Michael reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal response on heavy cream stationery. I recognized the letterhead immediately. The Hunt family. My father's law firm address. "We got this back 3 weeks later," Michael said, sliding the paper toward me. I looked down. The words were typed with a lethal, surgical precision. "My daughter has no interest in any contact. She is focused on her career and wishes to put this mistake behind her forever." Do not contact this family again, or we will pursue a restraining order for harassment. At the bottom was the signature, Patricia Hunt. The air in the room suddenly felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. My mother hadn't just taken my child. She hadn't just lied to Ben. She had spent the last 8 years actively murdering my reputation. She had turned me into a cold-hearted ghost in the eyes of the people raising my daughter. To the Walshes, I was a woman who called her own flesh and blood a mistake she wanted to forget. I felt a surge of pure, concentrated rage. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you scream. It was the kind that turns your blood into liquid nitrogen. I wanted to burn Wellesley to the ground. I wanted to see the look on Patricia's face when I finally choked the life out of her lies. The door to the hallway creaked open. A small figure stepped into the room. Lily. She was wearing that same purple wool sweater from the photo, but she looked taller in person, more real. She was holding a heavy, oversized scrapbook against her chest like a shield. She didn't look at Jennifer or Michael. She walked straight toward the couch where Ben and I were sitting. Her eyes were dark, fearless. She had my eyes. She sat on the floor and opened the book. It was titled, The Life of Lily. It was a collection of drawings, school projects, and photos. She flipped to the very last page. It was a crayon drawing of a house. Inside were Jennifer and Michael. But floating in the sky above the chimney were 2 stick figures with giant black question marks where their faces should have been. Lily looked up at me. She didn't know I was a captain. She didn't know I had survived mortar fire in the desert. She just saw a woman with hollow eyes and a broken heart. If you have ever looked at a family photo and felt like a stranger was staring back at you, you know this void. I need you to stand with me. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready to see these lies dismantled. In the comments, type the word Lily. Tell me your city and what time you're listening. I'm reading every single one of your stories. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It sounded like a countdown. Lily reached out and touched the rough fabric of my jacket. Mom Jen said you were busy saving the world, she whispered. Her voice was light, like a bell. But the letters Grandma Patricia sent said you didn't want to see me. She looked at Ben, then back at me. Her small lip trembled just a fraction. Do you want to keep me? The world stopped spinning. Every tactical plan, every legal strategy, and every bit of military discipline I had built up over a decade collapsed. I wasn't a captain anymore. I was a mother who had been starving for 8 years. I slid off the chair and knelt on the hardwood floor, getting down to her level. I didn't care about the lawyers or the Walshes. I reached out, my hands shaking, and cupped her face. Lily, I said. My voice was a vow, an oath. We want to keep you more than anything else in this world. We never stopped looking. We never gave up. Lily didn't say anything. She just leaned forward and tucked her head into the crook of my neck. She smelled like vanilla and childhood. We stayed like that for a long time. Jennifer and Michael didn't interfere. They saw the truth in the way I held her. The open adoption wasn't a legal threat anymore. It was a bridge. An hour later, Ben and I walked out onto the Brookline sidewalk. He was holding Lily's hand, walking her to the end of the driveway so she could show him her bike. I stood by the car, taking a breath of the freezing February air. I felt it then, that prickle on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. I scanned the street. 2 houses down, a black SUV was idling near the curb. The tinted windows were up, but I knew. I knew the silhouette of the person behind the glass. Patricia Hunt's radar had picked us up. The mistake was no longer hidden, and the war was officially moving from the shadows into the light. I didn't hide. I stood straight, squared my shoulders, and stared directly at the SUV. Come and get it, Mother, I whispered. The radar did not beep. It did not flash red. It just watched. Patricia Hunt was a shark in a Chanel suit. She spent her life scanning the social waters of Massachusetts for anything that looked like a drop of blood. On February 14th, 2026, she found it. She was driving her black SUV through Brookline, probably on her way to some overpriced charity brunch when she saw him. Ben. He was standing outside an ice cream parlor, laughing, and he was holding the hand of a girl in a purple wool sweater. Patricia didn't need a DNA test. She saw the dark curls. She saw the way the girl tilted her head. The mistake she had sold 8 years ago hadn't stayed buried. It was walking down the street, eating a double scoop of vanilla. On March 1st, the front door of my apartment didn't just open, it was breached. My father, George, didn't knock. He used his spare key, the one I had forgotten to take back, and slammed the door against the wall. Patricia marched in behind him, her face a mask of surgical-grade fury. I was standing at the kitchen island, my back to the window, scanning the room for threats before I even realized who it was. My hand went to the small of my back, reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. Habit. "You think you are clever, Maria?" Patricia spat. Her voice sounded like a rusted hinge. She didn't ask about her granddaughter. She didn't ask if the child was happy. "You think you can drag that brat into the light 2 weeks before your wedding? You want to humiliate this family in front of the entire parish?" George stepped forward, his face flushed a dark, angry purple. He looked like a man who was about to lose a very expensive bet. "We know what you are doing," he growled. "You are trying to trap Ben with a ghost. Well, it won't work. I will call him myself. I will tell him the truth. I'll tell him you were a tramp who didn't even know which barroom floor you conceived on. I'll ruin you before you ever walk down that aisle." I leaned back against the granite countertop. My knuckles were white as I gripped my lukewarm coffee mug. The ceramic groaned under the pressure. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the PTSD clawing at my throat, but I didn't flinch. I had stood in the path of incoming mortar fire. I wasn't going to break for a man in a silk tie. "Ben is the father, George," I said. My voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "The DNA is registered. The files are locked in a vault. You want to call him? Go ahead. He's the one who found her." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of a structural collapse. Patricia's eyes darted to the door, her brain already recalculating the optics. The smear campaign had hit a concrete wall. They pivoted. Narcissists always do. Within an hour, the threats turned into bribes. George talked about legal complications and protecting the girl's privacy. They offered us a month-long honeymoon in the Maldives, all expenses paid if I would just sign a non-disclosure agreement and keep the child away from the wedding guests. I gave them nothing. I practiced radio silence. For 2 weeks, I didn't answer their texts. I didn't pick up the phone when the church elders called to counsel me. I blocked their numbers. I went to work, I folded my laundry into perfect squares, and I waited. Desperate people do desperate things. On March 14th, 2026, the night before our rehearsal dinner, they sent a final invite. A reconciliation dinner at the big house in Wellesley. Just family, no lawyers. "It is a trap," Ben said as we pulled into their long, gravel driveway. "I know," I replied, checking my reflection in the visor mirror. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like an interrogator. But I want to see them try. The dining room in Wellesley smelled like lavender polish and burnt steak. George was at the head of the table, pouring a 2015 Cabernet with a hand that shook just enough to make the crystal clink against the glass. Patricia sat opposite him, her smile as sharp and fake as a department store mannequin. We sat down. The tension in the room was a physical weight, like the air right before a tornado hits. We didn't talk about the weather. We didn't talk about the wedding. George waited until the main course was served. He cut into his steak, the red juices pooling on the fine china. He looked at Ben, his eyes narrowing. "Ben, we have always liked you," George started. His voice was thick with fake concern. "We consider you a man of integrity. That is why this is so hard. Maria, she has a history. She had a child years ago. She gave it up. She never told you because she knew a man like you wouldn't want a woman with that kind of baggage. She's a liar, Ben. She's been using you." He leaned back, waiting for the explosion. He expected Ben to stand up, to look at me with disgust, to walk out of the room and leave me in the ruins. Patricia took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes locked on mine, savoring the kill. Ben didn't move. He didn't drop his fork. He picked up a piece of steak, chewed it slowly, and swallowed. Then he set his knife down with a soft clack that sounded like a hammer cocking. "I know about the child, George," Ben said. His voice was calm, lethal. "I know she is mine, and I know exactly how she ended up in Brookline." George's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Patricia's glass stopped halfway to her lips. "Your daughter isn't the liar in this room," Ben continued, leaning forward until he was inches from George's face. "She spent 8 years thinking I abandoned her because of the letters you forged. You sold our daughter to protect your seat on the parish board. You didn't just fail as parents. You operated like a criminal enterprise." Ben stood up and grabbed his coat. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, his eyes were warm. "The dinner is over," Ben said, turning back to the Hunts. "And so is the silence. We will see you at the hotel tomorrow. Bring your best smiles. You're going to need them when the truth walks through the door." He walked out. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and looked at Patricia. Her face was gray. The shark had finally run out of water. I didn't say a word. I just left them there in their big, empty house, surrounded by the smell of expensive wine and rotting secrets. March 28th, 2026. The Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston. This place was not built for people like me. It was built for people who inherited their names, their silver spoons, and their arrogance. The grand ballroom was a sea of gold leaf, heavy velvet curtains, and chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions of diamond. The air was thick with the scent of $500 a plate surf and turf, expensive cologne, and the suffocating smell of old money secrets. 40 guests. The elite of our parish. The lawyers, the board members, and the people who decided who was in and who was out in Wellesley. They were all there, clinking glasses and wearing trademarked smiles that didn't reach their eyes. George and Patricia Hunt stood near the head table like they owned the place. Patricia was wearing a silk gown that probably cost more than my first 2 years of military pay. She was glowing. She looked like a woman who had successfully buried a body and was now hosting a party on top of the grave. She thought she had won. She thought the dinner from hell in Wellesley had been the end of it. She thought my silence over the last week was a white flag. She was wrong. My silence was not surrender. It was a tactical hold. I stood near the bar, my spine a vertical line of cold steel. I was wearing a simple dark dress, but in my head I was still in my plates and Kevlar. I was not looking at the flowers. I was scanning the exits. I was timing the servers. I was waiting for the signal. Ben stood up. He did not look nervous. He looked like an architect about to pull the final support beam out of a crooked building. He took a silver spoon and tapped it against his crystal wine glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was sharp. It cut through the chatter like a gunshot in a library. The room went quiet. 40 heads turned. "Thank you all for being here," Ben said. His voice was steady, no tremor, no hesitation. "We are here to celebrate a union. But a house can only stand if the foundation is honest. And for 8 years, a vital piece of our foundation has been missing." He turned his head toward the massive oak doors at the back of the ballroom. He did not look at Patricia. He looked past her. "I would like to introduce a very special guest," Ben said. The doors creaked open. Jennifer Walsh walked in. She was dressed simply, looking like exactly what she was, a woman of integrity. And she was holding the hand of a small girl in a purple wool dress. The silence in the ballroom did not just happen, it solidified. It became a physical weight. I watched Patricia's face. It was a masterpiece of structural failure. The glow vanished. The silk dress suddenly looked like a shroud. Her skin went from a healthy tan to the color of wet drywall in 3 seconds. Beside her, George fumbled his glass. The red wine splashed across the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. "What is this?" Patricia hissed, her voice cracking the silence. She tried to stand, her hands clawing at the table for leverage. "This is a private event. This is a mistake. Security." But no one moved. Ben had handled the guest list. Ben had handled the security. Lily did not shrink back. She did not hide behind Jennifer's legs. She had spent 8 years being told she was not wanted, but she was a hunt by blood and a soldier by instinct. She let go of Jennifer's hand and walked 5 paces into the center of the room. She looked at the gold ceilings, then at the diamonds, and finally, her eyes locked onto Patricia. "Are you the one?" Lily asked. Her voice was high, clear, and carried to every corner of the ballroom. Patricia looked like she wanted to vomit. "Get her out of here," she whimpered, looking at the guests for support. Lily took another step. She did not shout. She just spoke the truth. "My mom, Maria, told me I had a grandma who lived in a big house. She said you were the one who told the doctors to take me away. She said you told everyone she was dead so you wouldn't have to look at me." Lily tilted her head, her dark curls bouncing. "Why did you want me to be a secret, Grandma? Am I a bad person?" A collective gasp ripped through the room. It was the sound of 40 reputations shattering at once. Mrs. Ruth, the matriarch of the parish, the woman whose approval Patricia had spent 30 years chasing, stood up slowly. She was not looking at the child. She was looking at Patricia with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look you give a cockroach in a high-end kitchen. "Patricia," Mrs. Ruth said. The name was a sentence. "We have sat in the same pew for 2 decades. We have listened to you talk about family values and the sanctity of life while you were busy selling your own flesh and blood to keep your country club membership." Patricia tried to speak. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She looked at George, but George was busy staring at the wine stain on the table, a broken man. "You did not just lie to your daughter," Mrs. Ruth continued, her voice gaining volume. "You used our church. You used our charity names to launder your shame. You have made this entire community a party to your cruelty." Mrs. Ruth grabbed her coat from the back of her chair. "You are a disgrace, Patricia. You make me sick. I think it is time the Hunts left. Now!" The room erupted, not with shouting, but with the cold, hard sound of 40 people turning their backs. Chairs scraped against the floor. Faces were turned away. The social death of George and Patricia Hunt was happening in real time, under the gold leaf of the Fairmont. Patricia grabbed her clutch, her face twisted in a mask of pure, concentrated hate. She tried to look at me, to find some weakness, but I stood my ground. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched her fall. She dragged George toward the exit, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. They did not walk. They fled. They ran through the oak doors, leaving behind the wine, the surf and turf, and the 30 years of lies they had built. The doors slammed shut. The ballroom was silent for a heartbeat. Then, Mrs. Ruth began to clap. Slowly at first. Then, Michael Walsh joined in. Then, Jennifer. Within 10 seconds, 40 of the most powerful people in Boston were standing, their applause echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling like thunder. I did not join them. I walked to the center of the room. I knelt down on the expensive carpet and opened my arms. Lily ran. She hit my chest like a small, warm mortar shell. I held her so tight I could feel her heart beating against mine. The mission was over. The target was neutralized. I looked up at Ben. He was standing by the head table, the sapphire ring box in his hand, a small, tired smile on his face. But as I pulled Lily closer, I saw a flash of black silk near the side entrance, a silhouette that did not belong. The war was not finished. It was just changing fronts. The thunder of the applause at the Fairmont had finally died down, replaced by the deep, brassy tolling of the bells at Old South Church. March 29th, 2026. A Sunday in Boston. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the wind off the harbor still had enough of a bite to remind you that winter was not quite done with us yet. I stood in the vestibule of the church, my hands steady on the bouquet of white roses. They were heavy, their stems wrapped tight in silk. I was not thinking about the flowers. I was thinking about the last time I stood in a sacred space. It was 2017, and I was being told that my life was a sin that needed to be managed, edited, and sold. Today was different. Today was an execution of the old life. I checked my reflection in a small tarnished mirror near the door. I did not see the broken girl from the Wellesley delivery room. I did not see the soldier who had spent years trying to bleed out the pain on foreign soil. I saw a woman who had finally found her coordinates. I stood straight, my shoulders square, the way I had been taught in basic training. Discipline is what keeps you alive when the emotions start to flood the deck. The doors opened. I did not have a father to walk me down the aisle. I did not want George Hunt anywhere near me. I did not need a man who had forged letters and sold my flesh and blood to hand me over to anyone. I walked alone. Every step on that stone floor was a nail in the coffin of the Hunt legacy. The front pew was a statement. In the spots reserved for the parents of the bride, there was nothing but empty space. No Patricia in her silk and fake pearls. No George with his lawyer's smirk. In the next row sat Jennifer and Michael Walsh. They did not look like guests. They looked like family. They looked like the people who had done the work while my own blood was busy playing God. And then there was Lily. She was standing at the front, wearing a white dress that looked like a cloud. She was holding a basket of petals, her dark hair pinned back with a silver clip. She saw me and gave a small, toothy grin. She was not a secret anymore. She was not a mistake. She was the reason the war had been worth it. Ben was waiting at the altar. He looked like he had not slept, but his eyes were clear. He did not look at my dress. He looked at me. He looked at the woman who had finally stopped running. He took my hand, and his grip was a grounding wire. We did not use the standard script. We did not talk about obeying, or for better or for worse. Those were words for people who had not seen the bottom of the pit. I promise to always choose the truth, Ben said. His voice was low, carrying through the high arches of the sanctuary. I will never leave you in the dark. I will never let a lie build a wall between us. I am your teammate, now and until the end of the line. I looked at him. I looked at Lily. I felt the ring slide onto my finger. It was a sapphire, heavy and cold. I promised to choose love over fear, I said. My voice was a vow, a soldier's oath. I've spent 10 years being afraid of what my own family could do to me. I'm done. I choose this family. I choose the truth we built together. The ceremony was short. No filler, no fluff. When we walked back down the aisle, the 40 guests, the same people who had watched the Hunts flee the Fairmont the night before, stood up. There was no whispering, just a quiet, heavy respect. We walked out of the church and into the sunlight of Copley Square. 1 week later, the white dress was gone. I was sitting in a lawyer's office in a high-rise in the financial district. The room smelled of stale coffee and expensive toner. Ben was beside me, his hand on my knee. Across the desk, a man named Holloway pushed a stack of papers toward me. "This is the cease and desist," he said. He was a shark in a gray suit. "It's been served. Certified mail. Delivery confirmed this morning at the Wellesley address." I picked up the pen. I signed my new name, Maria Foster. It felt like a victory. I had included a note with the legal documents. No screaming, no drama, just the cold reality. "You had 18 years to be parents," I had written. "You chose control instead. You had 8 years to tell the truth. You chose to lie. We are done. Do not call. Do not write. If you set foot on our property, I will have you arrested. This is your only warning." Holloway pointed to a gray machine in the corner of the office, an industrial shredder. "You want to do the honors?" I stood up. I took the mail receipt. I took the old family photos I'd been carrying in my wallet, the ones where I looked like a ghost while Patricia smiled for the camera. I took the letters George had forged. I fed them into the machine. Whir, crunch, zip. The shredder did not care about the Hunt name. It did not care about the 30 years of face they had tried to protect. It just turned the paper into white shrapnel. It turned the lies into dust. I listened to the mechanical grind. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of a slate being wiped clean. I watched the last of the paper disappear into the steel teeth. "It's over," Ben whispered. I did not answer. I just leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, looking out over the Boston skyline. I was not a victim. I was not a soldier without a home. I was a mother, a wife, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, dangerously free. I walked to the door, but I stopped with my hand on the handle. I heard a phone ring in the outer office. "It's for you, Mrs. Foster," the secretary called out. "It's a detective from the Wellesley PD." I did not move. I just tightened my grip on the door. The detective's call from Wellesley hadn't been a new threat. It had been the sound of a final, structural collapse. Patricia and George Hunt didn't go to jail. But in a town like Wellesley, social exile is a slower, colder kind of death. They were gone, moved to a gated community in Florida where nobody knew their names or the blood on their hands. For the first time in my life, the air in Massachusetts felt like it actually belonged to me. It didn't smell like their perfume or their lies anymore. Present day, summer 2026. Everything has shifted into a new orbit. We don't talk about custody or visitation intervals. We don't hide behind the cold, sterile language of a family court judge's ruling. Lily has 2 homes now. That is the reality. She has the Walshes in Brookline, and she has us. In our new place, a small, sturdy house with a backyard big enough for a grill and a swing set, there is a room at the end of the hall. It's painted a specific, defiant shade of purple. Not the pale lavender Patricia would have chosen to match the curtains. It's a deep, bold grape purple. Lily's choice. It smells like fresh cedar and the new rug we bought at Target. There are 2 closets in that room. One holds her school clothes and her soccer cleats. The other holds the history of a bridge we built out of the ruins. Jennifer Walsh and I don't pretend to be best friends. We don't do mommy and me yoga. But we share a respect that was forged in the fire of the Fairmont Ballroom. When she drops Lily off on Friday afternoons, we don't stand on the porch and trade fake smiles. We sit at the kitchen island. We talk about Lily's grades, her allergies, and the way she's starting to develop my stubborn streak. We share the coordinates of a life that we both have a stake in. No lawyers, no mediators, just 2 women who refuse to let a child be a casualty of someone else's shame. The healing isn't a straight line, it's a daily grind. Every Tuesday night, the 4 of us, Ben, myself, Jennifer, and Michael, sit in a circle in a therapist's office in downtown Boston. The room always smells like stale peppermint and recycled air. We do the work. We talk about the gaps. We learn how to tell Lily the truth without making her carry the weight of it. We tell her about the desert. We tell her about the bravery it took to find her. We don't use words like rejection or mistake. We use words like reconnaissance and rescue. I don't flinch when the mailman knocks anymore. I don't scan the perimeter of the grocery store for black SUVs. My home is a fortress, but it's not built of concrete and razor wire. It's built of truth. This afternoon, the sun is high and hot over the porch. I'm sitting in a wooden chair, a rag in one hand and a small tin of metal polish in the other. I have my old Army Commendation Medal on my lap. The brass is tarnished from years of sitting in a dark box. I rub the metal until the eagle starts to shine, reflecting the jagged light of the New England summer. Lily runs out of the screen door, her sneakers thumping against the wood. She's wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon cat on it and grass stains on her knees. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't ask for permission. She just throws her arms around my neck, her small, warm body pressing against my spine. "I love you, Mama Maria," she whispers. I close my eyes. I feel the heat of her skin. I feel the steady, uncomplicated beat of her heart against my shoulder. This is the warmth I was denied in that cold blue delivery room in 2017. This is the bond that Patricia tried to shred and sell. It didn't work. You can't kill something this stubborn. I pull her into my lap, the metal forgotten for a moment. We sit there in the quiet, watching the wind move through the oak trees at the edge of the yard. The war is over. The casualties have been counted. The survivors are standing. There are families you are born into. If you got a good one, consider yourself lucky. Hold on to it. But there are also families you have to fight for. Families you have to build with your own 2 hands out of the scrap metal of your past. Bloodlines, simple biology, aren't a default setting for love. Sometimes a bloodline is just a chain. If you're sitting in the dark right now, feeling the weight of a name that doesn't fit you, remember this. Courage isn't about how much you can endure before you break. Real courage is the moment you decide to stop enduring. It's the moment you stand up, strike a match, and burn down the lie of duty to build something honest. You don't owe your life to people who only want to control it. You owe it to the person you were meant to be before they started trying to edit you. My name is Maria Foster. I was a daughter, I was a soldier, and I was a secret. Today, I'm just a mother who came home from the front. Thank you for listening.